Welcome back. So this is part 2 of Republican and early Imperial Rome. We mentioned before that we break art history in Rome between the Republican period, when you have this kind of representative government, and the Imperial period, where you're ruled by the emperor. Well, the Imperial period begins with this person, who we usually call Augustus, but starts out his life as Octavian. And he's one of the most complex and fascinating characters in history. And this is where we're going to have to get into a lot of history, so I apologize, but there's going to just be a lot of talking here because there's no other way to get through it. Rome was a republic, but it was going through a period of a series of intense civil wars. And Rome had a very interesting method for dealing with crises like this. Whenever there was an invasion, a plague, or something, a crisis of leadership, they would actually invest all the power of the state into the hands of one individual. And that individual had the title of dictator. The problem with being a dictator is very rarely do people ever give up that power. For a long time, some of these dictators actually did. The most famous is Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus took power, and a few years later he returned power to the Republic. But you can imagine there were quite a few dictators that didn't want to. Sulla was a very infamous dictator in Roman history. So this caused a series of civil wars. So there was a solution that is, instead of just investing the power in one guy, we would actually invest it in 3 guys. And so there was a thing called the triumvirate. And the triumvirate invested power into the hands of 3 guys: Julius Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey the Great. And those 3 decided that they would share power, at least for a while, until eventually they all kind of turned on each other. Crassus goes off and gets himself killed in a campaign in Parthia against the Persians. The Persians say, "Why did you violate the peace treaty against us?" And he says, "Because I wanted gold." And they said, "Oh, you want gold?" So they poured molten gold down his throat. Now you know where George Martin got that idea. George Martin doesn't really have ideas. He just pillages history. And Julius Caesar has Pompey the Great killed, and so Julius Caesar becomes the sole power. Now, everybody thinks that Julius Caesar is the first emperor, but he's not. Julius Caesar is merely the last dictator. And he has the Roman Senate declare him dictator for life. And this had never happened before. There had been dictators who had held on to power, but there had never been somebody who had been declared dictator for life. And so there were a number of individuals that saw this as a threat. So on the Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BCE, Julius Caesar was assassinated while he was in the porticos of the theater of Pompeii. That's where the Senate was actually meeting at the time. And he gets knifed several times. There's another Brutus, Brutus and Cassius, made famous by the Shakespeare play Julius Caesar, who were there, and they kill him. And this causes, again, another crisis in Roman society. But it doesn't turn out the way the conspirators think. The conspirators thought that if we kill Julius Caesar, that's it, we can just restore the Republic and everything will go well. But Julius Caesar remained very popular with the people. He'd spread a lot of money around. He remained very popular with his army. He had conquered Gaul and brought lots of tribute into Rome. And so the conspirators end up fleeing, and they decide to form a second triumvirate. And that second triumvirate is made up of 3 people. Marcus Lepidus, who's an old hand in the Senate; Mark Antony, who is the second in command to Julius Caesar's army and his first lieutenant. Very popular, considered to be very attractive, very charismatic. And then the third was Octavian. And Octavian was just 19 years old at the time. He had never held office. He was kind of a scrawny, pencil-necked kind of guy. And he had only one claim to fame, and that was he was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. His father had died, and so his uncle, who was Julius Caesar, adopted him and made him his heir. But certainly Julius Caesar must have seen the promise in Octavian. Now, if you had lined these 3 up together in the second triumvirate, you would have thought for sure that sooner or later Marcus Lepidus or Mark Antony would have figured out how to bump off the other 2 and declare power for himself. but it didn't turn out that way. You never would have guessed this 19-year-old scrawny kid, Octavian, would have been the 800-pound gorilla in the room. But he was, because he was just a political machine. He was ruthless and smart and knew exactly how to manipulate everyone to get what he wanted. So the Second Triumvirate unifies together to get rid of the conspirators that killed Julius Caesar, but it's not long before they ultimately fall amongst themselves. Marcus Lepidus goes into self-imposed exile because he doesn't want to be caught in a battle between Mark Antony and Octavian. Mark Antony flees to Egypt and takes up with Cleopatra. Cleopatra had been the lover of Julius Caesar and had a son by him by the name of Caesarion, and so they were going to try and put Caesarion on the Roman throne. Octavian successfully managed to portray this as a foreign queen trying to meddle in Roman affairs. And so he goes to war against Mark Antony, and he defeats him in the Battle of Actium, this big sea battle in 31 BCE. Now, at that time, Augustus, or Octavian, wasn't much of a general, so he actually had his good close ally and friend Marcus Agrippa do it. According to legends, he was seasick in the hull of the boat, but whatever. He defeats Mark Antony. Mark Antony flees back to Egypt, and Mark Antony and Cleopatra end up committing suicide. And Octavian becomes the sole ruler of Rome. But he's smart. He knows he can't do this the way Julius Caesar did. His uncle grabbed all the power, and this immediately created enemies. So he does something very clever. He says, hey, guess what? I'm going to restore the Republic. And he says, I'm not going to seize power. I'm going to give it back to the people. But he does a number of things where he takes power indirectly. For example, he says, look, the tribunes are there to protect the people, so I'll be the champion of the people. I'll assume the tribunician power, which means I have the power to veto whatever the Senate does. Also, I want to keep an eye on the Senate, so I won't, take over the Senate. I'll just assume one of the consulships in perpetuity, so I can watch on the Senate. And then he does things like, well, Egypt was such a problem. It was this cause of this revolt against us, so I'll take care of Egypt as a proconsular command. The problem is, Egypt happens to be the richest province in the empire, so he now has all the money he needs. And so little by little, he doesn't seize power outright. He nibbles around the edges, but he cobbles together a collection of powers that basically give him the ability to veto or overrule anything he doesn't like. And he becomes the true power of Rome. And so while he claims to restore the Republic, he actually completely subverts it. He kind of takes these little emergency powers around the edges and manages to take complete control. And he's a very interesting character because there's no evidence that he personally enriched himself. He lived in a very modest home. He wore very modest clothing. He never went out with much more than a simple bodyguard or entourage. He really was an aw shucks kind of guy who sent I'm just a public servant. I'm just here to serve the people. But secretly, he was this il patron, this kind of gangster who was running everything behind the scenes. And then he proceeded to rule Rome for another 40 years. So for a period of over 50 years, he has the opportunity to remake Rome in his image. And he really does. He writes a long will, the Res Gestae, at the end of his life. And in it, he boasts, I found Rome a city of brick, and I left it a city of marble. And that's actually true. He uses the money that he gathers from all of these activities to rebuild Rome, and doesn't really personally enrich himself, but actually strengthens and empowers Rome. And in 13 to 9 BCE or CE, he founds the Ara Pacis, which is this altar of peace. And this really is a way of demonstrating that he has established this new kind of life that exists in Rome. This is what we call the Pax Romana, the idea that you have peace, you have prosperity, you have stability, you have conquests and tribute coming in. Life in Rome is good, so why should you complain if you lose your vote or lose your representative government? And most people sign on with this. It's a good deal for most people, frankly. And he gets a couple of new titles. The first title he gets is Imperator. Imperator means literally first man. So it's not like a king, because remember, Rome doesn't like kings. They overthrew the last kings. So he becomes the first man. And the idea is that he's supposed to be the first amongst equals. But in reality, he's an emperor. He's in charge. And they also give him a new name. And the new name is Augustus. And it reflects the great pride and great admiration that the Roman Senate and people had for him. So he was the kind of guy that if you got on his wrong side, you would suddenly show up, disappeared, and your body would, float up, downstream in the Tiber River. He was not a person to be trifled with. But on a day-to-day basis, he let Romans live their lives, and he secured peace and prosperity. And he eventually, of course, dies in 14 CE. This is the same emperor that is referenced in some of the opening chapters of the book of Luke, where Augustus decrees the census that all the world should be taxed. And that's how the nativity story begins. So while he doesn't spend a lot of money on himself, he does spend a lot of money securing his destiny and his legacy. And he spends a ton of money on art and public projects to secure that legacy. And you can see the transformation in his portrait. So this is what Octavian looked like in the Republican period. Kind of weak-chinned, big head, Bill Gates' stupid haircut, pencil-necked, long nose, not a very attractive guy. And of course, this was made at a time period when verism, this love of absolute reality and faithfulness to truth, was the standard in Roman portraiture. But then he gets one hell of a makeover, and this is what he looks like afterwards. Wow. I guess he must be doing the CrossFit. He gets a much stronger chin. He gets a much thicker neck. He looks a lot healthier, broader. I mean, all of us go through an awkward phase, don't we? And then, maybe he was a late bloomer. Well, obviously no, he's not a late bloomer. You can tell that while this is still Octavian, his portrait has been idealized, and he takes on the persona of Augustus, this new ruler who has brought peace and prosperity to Rome and ended the civil wars and all of the humiliations of Rome. And his portraits never age. You never see Octavian look old or weak or frail. He is always going to be depicted young, virile, masculine, idealized. And where is he getting this idea? Well, he's getting this idea from the Greeks. Augustus very much wanted to create a new golden age for Rome, and he wanted this reflected in all of the art and culture. Here's one of the really great statues of Augustus. This is the Primaporta Augustus. It was found in Primaporta. Primaporta is a little town just outside of Rome where his wife, Livia, had a villa. And this was probably made either in the last year of his death or just after he died. So he was in his 70s when this was made. Boy, I hope I look this good when I'm in my 70s. Well, obviously, he didn't look this good when he was in his 70s. This was made to exemplify him, to idealize him. And everything about this portrait is intentional. Everything here is meant to reinforce his legacy and his identity. It's also important to remember this would have been painted, even though we don't have the paint today. Again, it would have tried to create this lifelike presence. But let's get into the iconography of this thing. So first and foremost, you should recognize the high degree of naturalism and the high degree of classicism in this piece. His posture, his proportions, his dimensions are nearly identically copied from some of the most important works out of classical Greece. And he's deliberately trying to evoke that era of 5th century Greece, that moment where Greece entered its high point and its golden age. You can see that the feet are positioned in exactly the same way as the very famous statue of Doryphorus. He even has the exact same posture. Notice that his feet are unshod. Remember that unshod feet in the Greek world indicated that the figure was heroic, epic character, an athlete, a warrior, a god. And so the same thing is happening here. Notice that he has the same broad, muscular proportions, the kind of thick Adonis belt, although it's hard to see under the armor, etc. So everything about this is meant to indicate, hey, we are bringing back a new classical era, much like the 5th century in ancient Greece. The iconography is also very important too. He holds his hand aloft in a gesture of oration. Notice that the fingers are held loosely, the forefinger is extended. It's like he's hailing a cab. But no, this is a gesture of adlocutio. This is addressing the troops. And appropriately, he is wearing armor to indicate that he is the father of the camp. That is, he's the commander-in-chief of the Roman armed forces. And he also has a toga draped around his middle to show that he is a freedman. He is of patrician rank. There's some other details here that are a little bit harder to understand, such as this one. This is what my daughter refers to as the mascot of Single Awareness Day, but you probably know him more commonly as Cupid. Now again, this is done in marble, and in marble you need a support. You need a tree stump or a column or something, because marble is very brittle, and if you didn't, the statue would break. But it's very interesting that the artist here has chosen to do a statue of Cupid riding on a dolphin. Now, what does this mean? This isn't, again, accidental. Who is Cupid? Well, Cupid is the son of Venus and Mars, the gods of love and war. But it even goes a little deeper than that. The Julii family, that is the family of Julius Caesar, claimed that they were descended from the goddess Venus. And so what we think's going on here is that he's saying, hey, I am a child of Venus too. I am a descendant of Venus in the same way that Cupid is a descendant of Venus. So he has added in his relation here to show his divine heritage. One of the first things that Augustus did is he had Julius Caesar declared a god. They actually built a temple to the divine Julius Caesar. So he is, reinforcing the idea that, hey, I am partially divine. I am the son of a god, and I am the descendant of a goddess. As we get to the center, you'll notice that he's wearing this magnificent breastplate. This is what we call a lorica musculata. It's a breastplate made to look like muscles and a torso. It's also elaborately decorated. There's a number of scenes going on here. First off, in the top, we have Ouranos, the god of the sky, holding up the heavens, and we have chariots. We have figures with torches representing the night, and we have figures in chariots representing the dawn arriving. So this is literally the dawning of a new age. And he shows this figure down here. This is a Tellus figure. Notice she holds a cornucopia. You probably recognize those from decorations at Thanksgiving. The cornucopia is this mythical object in Greek mythology that would spontaneously produce the food of the gods. So it's a symbol of plenty. So what he's saying is that I am ushering in a new era of peace and prosperity and plenty, and all of the world is rejoicing at my triumph. And then in the very center we have a kind of an odd scene. We have this individual wearing pants, and that's significant. Romans didn't wear pants. Pants were actually forbidden in the city of Rome. Barbarians wore pants. So you could tell by the fact this guy's got kind of a shaggy haircut and he's wearing pants that he's a representation of a barbarian. And this is a kind of a generic stereotype that Romans use to represent any enemy. It doesn't matter. It could be Persians, it could be Gauls, it could be anything. But this is how they represent the other, the enemy. And he is holding a staff, and on the top of that staff is an eagle right there. This is the Aquila. The Aquila is the symbol of the Roman armies. It is the standard of the Roman armies. And he is handing this staff back to a Roman soldier. So what's going on here? Well, at around this time, the Romans had suffered a humiliating defeat to the Parthians, which was the new Persian dynasty. And this was devastating, and it really hurt the honor of the Roman legions. So Augustus negotiated the return of the Aquila, the standard, so that he could restore their honor. So that's a very interesting image. It's saying, you know, the whole military breastplate itself is saying, I am a man of war, but in the center of it is a message saying, I am also a man of peace. None of the imagery of Augustus was ever left to chance. This is an image of Augustus as the Pontifex Maximus. This is another one of those wonderful details where Augustus managed to noodle himself into the politics of the time. The Pontifex Maximus, the name literally means the big bridge builder. Rome had many different cults and religions, but they had one priest that was supposed to negotiate all of these religions and how they worked together. And that was the Pontifex Maximus. And this is a title that still exists today. It was inherited by the Pope of Rome. So he was there to negotiate the kind of overarching system of cults that existed. This was an elected position in ancient Rome, and it was not a very popular position because it required a lot of ritual that was very tedious, and it could be very time-consuming. But he said, guess what, I'll just accept the title of Pontifex Maximus, and I'll take care of that. Well, the Pontifex Maximus had a very important job. That job was he got to read the signs in the heavens and the flights of birds. And that was important because this was how you determined whether to go to war or not. So by accepting the title of Pontifex Maximus, he guaranteed that nobody else would be able to read the signs and say, nope, can't go to war, not a good time, the stars and the birds are not right. So again, a very clever way of taking a small power here and a small power here and not looking too threatening, but together they add up to something very powerful. So the imagery again shows him as youthful. The other thing is that it shows him as pious. Notice that he's wearing the toga, but he has pulled the sinus, that's this kind of long baggy part of the toga, up over his head. And this was a gesture of piety, that when you acted as a priest in the Roman state, you would pull the sinus up over your head. So all of this art is meant to convey the idea that you can trust Augustus. They didn't have Twitter in the Roman world, so if a leader wanted to get into contact with the people directly, he can't go on television and give a presidential speech. He can't go to Twitter. He has to do it through art. And remember that most people at the time are still functionally illiterate. So the way you demonstrate your benefit to society is by doing public works or by doing statues. And to that end, he actually rebuilt large chunks of the Roman Forum, and this is where we have the first major expansion of the Roman Forum. So this is the Roman Forum right here. This is the Basilica Julia. This is the Basilica Aemilia. There's the Curia. That's the Senate House. And Julius Caesar was in the process of building an addition to the Forum right here. And Augustus comes along and he finishes that, as well as building a temple to the divine Julius Caesar, which is located right here. But the big thing that he did is he added a whole second forum that was the Forum of Augustus. And this is the beginning of what we call the Imperial Fora, or the expansion of the Forum Romanum into the Imperial phase. And every emperor at this point will now add a major new forum. Rome has to have places for people to meet, for markets, for court cases, for public speaking, and so he builds this. And it really is a way of establishing his legacy. Here's a reconstruction of it. He builds a massive stone wall. And this isn't just for, giggles. He's actually building this because on the other side of this was the Suburra. And the Suburra was a city made mostly out of brick and wood, and it was very often plagued by urban fires. And so to prevent it, so he very much wants to protect this. So this is a fire break. And in the center of it, he builds a massive temple. And the temple is to Mars Ultor, Mars the Avenger. When he decided to go after the conspirators that killed Julius Caesar, he made an oath that he would build a temple to Mars the Avenger if he was successful, if he aided him in this quest. So this was the fulfillment of a religious vow. So Mars the Avenger. I don't know if he's going to show up in Phase 4 or not. Maybe. We'll see. But if you look around, you'll notice that the whole thing is surrounded by a portico But on top of the portico, we see caryatids. So where have we seen caryatids before? We saw caryatids at the Erechtheion, which is, again, one of these masterpieces of Greek architecture from the 5th century, from the Golden Age of Greece. So this isn't an accident. These caryatids are deliberately copied after the caryatids in Athens. And he's trying to say that, hey, I am bringing in a golden age in much the same way that a golden age was brought into Athens. He also rebuilds whole areas of the city. So if we go back to our map of Rome, this region of Rome today is known as the Campus Martius, or the Field of Mars. Now, anciently, this was outside the city of Rome and outside the city walls, but it's located roughly this area right here. That's where you can find it. But this was the area where they would do sacrifice, and this was also the area where they would perform cremations of famous individuals. So the Field of Mars was a very important location, and he transforms a large part of the Field of Mars into a series of memorials to himself. And the most important feature there is the Ara Pacis. The Ara Pacis is the altar of peace. And he created the altar of peace to commemorate the Pax Romana, this idea that I came in a time of civil war, I gave peace to Rome, and I also, settled all of the wars and conflicts with our neighbors by either conquering them or diplomatically in some cases. And this ushered in an era of peace and prosperity for Rome. So he wanted to commemorate. And of course, it's a monument to peace, but it's also a monument to himself because he's the one who brought about the peace. The altar is a beautiful altar, open to the sky, but it's also a very interesting altar in that it doesn't really follow the design of previous altars. In the center is an altar, and it has a door on either side. And here you can see it in this reconstruction. The doors are symbolic. Rome had a very famous temple dedicated to the god Janus, and Janus was the god of beginnings and endings. That's why the month at the beginning of the year is January, because he is the god of the beginning and ending of the year. And that's when the year begins and ends. And that temple had two doors. Janus had two faces, one backward and one forward, so he could see into the past and into the future. And when Rome was at peace, the doors to the temple of Janus were open. But when they were at war, they were closed. And so here you can see you have two doors, one on either side, and they're perpetually open. The idea being that he has ushered in a kind of perpetual peace. The altar would have been painted as all ancient statuary would have been painted. It would have been just fabulously decorated. And it really is this just kind of tour de force of classicism. On the inside, it is decorated with garlands. These represent the bounty of the sacrifice and of the peace and prosperity. There are also bucranions. Bucranions are skulls of cows. These are representations of sacrifice. There's also patens. These are sacrificial, vessels that exist. So on the interior, the themes are all oriented around sacrifice and gratitude and bounty to the gods. On the exterior, lower portions, we have these beautiful acanthus scrolls, these very high-end acanthus scrolls. But this is what we call an inhabited acanthus or vine scroll, because it's full of living creatures in one way or another. Some are obvious. There are collections of birds, in some cases geese or swan, which have symbolic meaning. But even in the little foliage, you'll find things like a frog, or a scorpion, or sometimes bizarre scenes of a serpent attacking a nest of birds and one little bird fleeing. Here's a lizard up here. And people have often speculated what's going on. Well, on one level, this just gives delight and humor to it. It's just a way of enriching the sculpture. Others, that there's probably symbolic content. Scorpio is an astrological sign, and so this may be a reference to a birth date. Many people have speculated that this bird here represents the fleeing of Aeneas. Aeneas was one of the founding rulers of Rome, And that's the story told in the Aeneid, and he was one of the princes to escape the destruction of Troy. So this maybe is a symbolic way of representing the destruction of Troy, and how it is the remnant, is the person who's fled, who eventually went on to go found Rome. That makes pretty good sense because there's a lot of panels that deal with Aeneas. Here we have a panel that shows Aeneas sacrificing to the Penates. The Penates are these household gods that are seen here. So here he is offering sacrifice to these household gods, which were very popular and very important in Roman religion. Elsewhere, the scenes again show the prosperity of Rome. In the Tellus relief, we have Tellus herself. She's a Mother Earth figure. You can see that we have animals at her feet, indicating the bounty and the prosperity, and the how nature has come forward in all its prolific nature to feed the world. Notice that we have a figure riding on a goose that's over here, and we have a figure riding on a sea serpent or a dragon over here. So we have earth, sea, and sky are all coming together to live peacefully and to bring bounty to the children of the earth because of Augustus. It's very classical. The drapery looks very much like the drapery that we see on the balustrade of the Temple of Athene, Nike. And then we have this panel, which is really a very fascinating panel. So while there's a fair amount of depiction of gods and goddesses here, again, Romans have this penchant for the mundane, for the everyday. And this family shows an imperial procession. And here's where things kind of get meta, because it's an imperial procession dedicating this altar. So it shows the dedication of this altar. And unlike the Greek, which is, showed gods and figures mixing together, again, these are only figures from the imperial family themselves, and only figures that were living at that time. So it shows a historical moment. It starts off on the one end, and unfortunately this is the most fragmentary end, and this end shows Augustus himself. This is the most head-on view I could find of it. And Augustus is a little bit taller than everybody else, but he's mostly the same size, and he is presiding over this sacrifice. Behind him you see these guys with these pointy hats. These are the Flamines. Flamines are priests that preside at these events. It's such a beautiful relief. We have incredibly high classical drapery, but I love how the figures in the background are lower relief, and the figures in the foreground are almost rendered in the round, and it gives this incredible sense of depth. As we move down the procession, we eventually wind up with a procession of the imperial family themselves. So we have a collection of figures here, all from the imperial family. I want you to notice that even the children and the little boys and girls are in attendance. Notice that the little Roman boys have short haircuts, like good Roman boys should, and notice that the Roman boys are wearing togas, because even though they're little boys, they are free men. They are born free, and so they get to have togas. This one actually has a bulla. A bulla is an amulet around the neck. Here's another bulla, and these were specifically worn by little boys as a form of protection. Not sure why little girls didn't get them, but... And I love how you can see that they're like little kids everywhere. They're tugging on their parents' togas, saying, where are we going? How long is this going to last? There's this wonderful quality of everyday life here, of people talking to each other, how long is this going to take? Some look bored, some look more interested than others. It's really kind of fascinating. And then we get a little bit of a more fascinating character in the next panel. So up here at the front, we have a view of those Flamines and their strange pointy skull caps, but you can see how the relief is worked very cleverly there, so that the low relief is in the background, high relief is in the foreground. But I want to concentrate on this boy here. This boy is clinging to the robes of Marcus Agrippa. Marcus Agrippa is the consigliere to Augustus, that these two were two young men that kind of came together, and he was his right-hand man. He was his kind of enforcer in the Roman state. So very, very powerful person in the imperial household. And clinging onto his robes is a child, and then the woman behind them is reaching forward to place her hand lovingly on the hand of the child. But if you look at this child, This child doesn't look like the other children. Let's just refresh your memory and go back to the previous image. Notice how the Roman children here, or the Roman boys, have short haircuts. They wear togas and other tunics. But this boy, he actually has long hair, and he's wearing pants. Remember what I said about pants? Pants are worn by barbarians. And notice also he has a torque. Do you remember the monuments from Pergamon that had the dying Gallic chieftains? Remember how they were wearing torques? Torques are marks of nobility for barbarians. So this is a barbarian child. So what's going on here? For the longest time, people wondered, is this a Roman boy dressed up like a barbarian child? That's not impossible. They don't do it anymore, but when I was a kid, people played cowboys and Indians, and we know that Romans played Romans and barbarians. It's kind of funny. That's the way it works. But we don't think so. We think he's actually a barbarian child, and this child is most likely an imperial hostage. So what's an imperial hostage? Well, remember, Rome could be very, very ruthless. So when Rome conquered a new state, or a state revolted against Rome, Rome would go in and conquer them, and they would take the princes, the young children of the royal family of the state that they'd conquered, and they would take them as hostages back to Rome. Now, the intent of this is that, hey, if you guys ever revolt again, we have your children, and we will not hesitate to kill your children if you revolt. So this was a way of basically extorting compliance of these conquered nations. But they didn't take these hostage children and, throw them in a cell and feed them a crust of bread once a week. No, they actually brought him into the imperial household. So this child, by the fact that he's clinging to the robe of Marcus Agrippa, has been adopted into the home of Marcus Agrippa as a child, as a son. He will be raised as a Roman. He'll be taught to read and write, both Greek and Latin. He will live in a palace. He will have indoor plumbing and bathhouses and servants. He will also enjoy all the entertainments of Rome, the gladiatorial games, the chariot races, the theater, music, all of the entertainments. He'll enjoy the shopping, etc. And he'll be taught all the features of Roman civilization, Roman law, Roman culture, Roman theater, Roman military practice even. And then when he becomes of age, the Romans will, say, well, you are now of age. It is time for you to return to your home country. So he'll return to his home country, which will be somewhere in Gaul and what is modern day France, and where there's no theater, there's no chariot races, there's no bathhouses, there's no indoor plumbing, there's no libraries, there's no culture, and he'll go, wow, what a dump. And he'll be inspired to make his home more like Rome. And so this is what Rome did. Rome spread the benefits of Rome everywhere they went. And they encouraged everybody to embrace all of the features of Roman life and to Romanize, to bring all of these great aspects of civilization. We don't know the identity of this child, but presumably that's who he was. And so what is he doing in this relief? Remember, this isn't accidental. This isn't like a snapshot. This had to be sculpted. And so this means that Augustus really wants people to know that, hey, everybody is a part of my empire. Even these people that, are out on the fringes of the empire, they too will be part of the empire. They too can have peace and prosperity, which is either an encouraging or a threatening idea, depending on how you look at it. I talk a lot about cultural assimilation in my non-Western class, so there you go, at cultural assimilation. It's a lot of good and a lot of bad, both ways. So the Ara Pacis was part of a series of structures built on the Campus Martius. This is the Ara Pacis itself. He also had an obelisk brought from Egypt, and he set up a massive orologium, or kind of sundial. And that was a way of saying, hey, the whole universe, the times and the seasons are now in order. But the last monument is his tomb. He really did spend a lot of money on his legacy. So the tomb is still there. This is the Museum of the Ara Pacis right there. The Ara Pacis was a little bit elsewhere, but they moved it to that location. And this is the mausoleum. It's a series of concentric rings, and there would have been a series of tombs inside. So if you went inside, there is a kind of annular ring, and the annular ring would have had niches for the ashes and tombs of the entire imperial family. But the exterior would have been this massive tumulus with a kind of rising central section. And there's debates about whether this was landscaped or not. Some people say it was, some people say it wasn't. But again, it's clear that the goal here was to create a lasting monument that tied into these ancient cultures. Remember that the Etruscans built tumuli and had long-standing family tombs that they would constantly come back to renew the deceased. So this was more than just, a place to be buried. This was an everlasting monument to remind people of his legacy. And here's a couple different reconstructions of it. Well, this brings us to the Julio-Claudians. So Augustus, even though he, ruled Rome for more than 40 years, there was one major failing of his reign, and that is that he never produced a direct heir. He adopted two of his nephews, Gaius and Cassius, but they died in childhood, and so they didn't get a chance to be heirs. And so he really didn't produce an heir from the Julii line. But he married a woman by the name of Livia, who had a son from a previous marriage. And that son was Tiberius. And she eventually persuaded him to make his stepson his heir and to become the next emperor. And so he did, and he allowed that to happen. And when he finally died, then it passed on. And so she was from the Claudia family, he was from the Julia family, and so that's why we call the dynasty that followed Augustus the Julio-Claudians, because they represent this blended family that come together, but most of the kids who rule are actually from, kind of her side of the family. So Augustus was the first and established them, and he passes it on to Tiberius. And all of these later Julio-Claudians continue the traditions of Augustus. Tiberius passes it on to Gaius Germanicus, who we know more commonly as Caligula. Caligula was a childhood nickname that means little boots, because he would go around the palace stomping around in military boots, pretending to be a Roman general. Caligula was regarded as one of the best emperors. Became an emperor at a very young man, was very dynamic, very smart, very wise. Then he got a brain fever and he went crazy. He made his horse a senator. He sent the Roman army to Britain to gather seashells. He was crazy. He was nuts. He even had all of the statues remade with his face. All of the statues of the gods were remade with his face, even the female statues. So eventually, people had enough of that, and his own bodyguard killed him, and they passed it on to his uncle, Claudius. And Claudius was a bit of a reformer. People think of him as a bit of a duffer, but he was a pretty good emperor and a reformer, and this is an image of Claudius. And as you can see, he's kind of an ordinary guy, but it looks like this body has been photoshopped. Looks pretty shopped to me. And they continue this tradition of Augustus, that they never allow the ruler to age. They never allow him to be seen as frail or weak. He always has these idealized features, these high, Greek classical features. So here is Emperor Claudius being depicted as Jupiter, and supporting him is the eagle, which is a kind of representation of Jupiter. So then we have Claudius, and then it passes on to Nero. And he's the last of the Julio-Claudian line because he was really awful. Really one of the worst tyrants in human history. Just so you know, before Hitler came along, Hitler is now the gold standard for comparing people to evil. If you want somebody to be evil, you say he's as bad as Hitler. Before Hitler came along, Nero was what everybody compared people to. He was the gold standard for evil. So for, holy cow, 19 centuries, Nero had held the title as being the most wicked man in history, and Hitler took it away from him. Darn it. So I wonder if he's upset about that. He probably is. He was a piece of work. At any rate, so he was so terrible that eventually the Senate forced his ouster, and forced him to commit suicide. And that brings an end to the Julio-Claudians. So, but you do have this long period of influence on this period. What's interesting is that while Augustus was pretty temperate in his personal and private life, and really only spent money on state and his legacy, that's not true of any of his heirs. All of his heirs spent lavishly on palaces and buildings, etc. You'll see. You'll get to see some of these. Not very much from the time of Gaius Germanicus survives, but because he was so hated. But we'll see if some of the others. When you see the Golden House of Nero, it'll make your eyes goggle. Anyhow, so let's talk about Tiberius. Tiberius was a pretty decent, emperor. He was probably, one of the more stable emperors, but he did love pleasure palaces. He built a number of pleasure palaces. He's the first to build up the Domus Augustana on the Palatine Hill. He's the first to actually build a series of pleasure palaces down in Capri and elsewhere. But one of the more interesting ones is at Sperlonga. Sperlonga is a resort town. It was a resort town then, and it's a resort town now. Beautiful, kind of gulf with beautiful beaches. And at one end of the beach is this large natural grotto. And that large natural grotto was actually the location of a little villa, a little pleasure palace built by Tiberius so that he could get away from the stresses of Rome. It had a large villa, but the most fascinating part of it is his triclinium. His triclinium was his dining hall, and his dining hall was actually built right into an existing grotto that he then expanded, and that grotto is still there. So the grotto has a saltwater pool on the outside and a freshwater pool on the inside, so his guests could sit here and enjoy all kinds of magnificent feasts while looking out on the ocean. The waves would lap. According to tradition and legend, you could dangle your feet out into the water, and Tiberius even had little boys who would swim up and nibble on your toes so you could get the experience of having your toes nibbled by fish. Being an emperor makes you weird. There's so much power you shouldn't have. Anyhow, but the thing that is important to us is that this was actually the site of a major set of monumental sculptures. Tucked away in the niches of this kind of magnificent pleasure palace and dining hall were a series of statuary groups. And all the statuary groups had to deal with the Trojan War, and particularly with the story of Odysseus. So in the center, we have the scene of Scylla and Odysseus. So Scylla is this great sea monster, this terrifying sea monster that has dogs for legs. And as you can see, she's absolutely gigantic. And Odysseus is here trying to pilot past her as he's on his desperate way to get home, and she's ripped an oar off the ship and killing people with it. It's really kind of a dramatic scene. This was found in this cave in a very fragmentary state. This is a reconstruction of it, but here you can see that the figures have these deep-set eyes, very deep-cut mouths, and wild hair. The other scene is an absolutely colossal statue. Just to give you a sense of this, these figures here are much larger than life size. So this figure here is much, much larger than life size. And this is the story of the blinding of Polyphemus. Polyphemus is, or Polyphemus if you prefer, was this cyclops. He was this giant cyclops that captured Odysseus and his men in a cave and wouldn't let them leave. And they escape in part by waiting till he falls asleep and gouging out his eye with a hot poker. So here you can see Odysseus. Odysseus is always recognizable because he has this very characteristic felt cap. And his men here are blinding Polyphemus in his sleep so that he cannot see them when they escape. They manage to escape by clinging to the bellies of sheep, so that when Polyphemus feels the sheep, he only feels them and doesn't feel them. Doesn't feel the people underneath. So these statues are amazing, but what was amazing is that, even more amazing, is that they actually had an inscription that gave the names of the artists. And the artists are artists that we knew from another very famous work of art, the Laocoon. The same artist, Hagisandros Polydorus and Athenodorus of Rhodes. Now, I suppose it's possible that this is a different Hagisandros Polydorus and Athenodorus of Rhodes, but probably not. These are probably the same artists. These are Greek artists from the island of Rhodes being brought in. And we always thought that this statue, the Laocoon, with its incredible, tortured, very Hellenistic, dramatic composition and deep-cut hair and deep-set eyes, that this was a product of the Hellenistic period and dated to somewhere around the 2nd century BC. But when you find a series of statues with the same names from the 1st century, that indicates that no, this is probably not these people's great-great-grandsons. It's probably going to be the same artists. And that's caused a kind of rethinking. Remember what I said about plebeian art, that there's many different styles in the Roman Empire. And so here we have a Hellenistic style statue, at the same time that the Roman Empire is, in its official art, using classical style statues. So many different styles exist at the same time. You have the more energetic and exaggerated style of the Hellenistic style, with its figures with wild hair and dynamic diagonal action. And you also have more classical styles. And then you even have plebeian styles beyond that. You can really see the comparison here. This is the head of Odysseus with his very characteristic cap. And he has this incredibly deep-set eyes, open mouth, wild hair. He looks very, very similar to the Laocoon. So no doubt these were made by the same Hagisander, Polydorus, and Athenodorus. Also, if you happen to be having triplets, you might consider that as a name. I think that would be a good choice. You shouldn't make those recommendations in Utah. People take you seriously. All right, let's go to Nero. So Nero was an abject tyrant and really an outrageous character. He was, oh gosh, every horrible thing that you can imagine is credited to Nero. He's the one that supposedly, fiddled while Rome burned. Well, he didn't have a fiddle. He had a lyre. But what they mean by that is that Rome was very, very plagued by fires. It was a common occurrence. And when the city burned and it gutted out the center of the city, instead of returning the city back to the people, he actually took it over and turned it into his own private Disneyland. So just so you get a sense, this is the Forum of Augustus right here. This is the tail end of the Roman Forum. And he basically took all of this, everything like this, and turned it to his own private pleasure palace in the center of Rome. You can imagine how this might chafe people, because a city is gutted by fire and you just take it over and build this palace. The palace is amazing. Very little of it survives because it was torn down after Nero's reign, but we do have a few buildings and a few parts of it that survive. And it's remarkable because it shows us how experimental Roman architecture had become. It has this beautiful octagonal room. Some of the chambers are still there. Remember, there's no bulldozers in the ancient world, and so unlike our times where we just bulldoze something and start from the bedrock or the foundations, oftentimes when you rebuild something, it was easier just to fill it or bury it in earth. And so we are still unburying some of these chambers, and we're finding some of the stucco from the time still intact, with these beautiful, what we call grotesque, little tiny paintings and drawings. The octagonal room, many people believe, is his triclinium. His triclinium had a rotating roof so that it could show the night sky in motion. But what's really ingenious about this room is that it has light wells that the person standing in the room here couldn't see, but they direct light into these ancillary rooms so that they wouldn't be so dark. When it was in its prime, it probably looked something like this. The floors and the lower walls would have been covered with marble revetment, and the upper stories would have been covered with stucco. It must have just been gobsmacking. And it shows that because we have this strange segmented dome in these 8-sided rooms, it shows that architecture was getting increasingly more experimental. It's not just rectangular spaces or simple barrel vaults anymore. And we'll see that as we go on in Roman architecture. It does get more and more complex and more experimental and more focused on creating these wild interior spaces and vistas. So moving on from Nero, we're going to move down here to the Gulf of Naples. And the Gulf of Naples is important because not only is this the location of Neapoli, this is the location of the very famed Vesuvius, the volcano that destroyed alternately Pompeii and Herculaneum. But it also destroyed a number of smaller villas and locations around it. The destruction of Pompeii and Herculaneum was absolutely devastating. We actually know a great deal about it because in 79 CE, Pliny the Elder was in Naples, Neapoli, and he saw the destruction and he got in a ship and attempted a rescue. The whole destruction took place over a course of about 36 hours. And so he went there, rescued as many people as he could, but eventually succumbed to poisonous gases and had to be evacuated and later died because of it. Pompeii was buried in a fast ashfall that was so fast that it buried people alive. When they excavated this in the 18th century, they kept finding all of these cavities created by the deceased bodies that had rotted away. And so the archaeologist said, I think these are the cavities left behind by the bodies. So he poured plaster into them, and he caught people almost in their death throes. It's really kind of remarkable. Herculaneum was kind of a resort town on the other side, and it actually got it worse. It was actually buried by a pyroclastic mud flow, this hot, frothy mix of mud and ash, and that comes down and boils you alive before it buries you alive. Fun times. There were also a number of resort villas on the on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius that got buried. We'll take a look at a few of those. So the whole thing was buried in the course of a little over 72 hours, most of it in the first 36 hours, and it covered the entire city with so much ash that within a generation nobody even knew where the city was anymore. It was a remarkable destruction. People had no idea. I mean, they knew that this was a volcanically active area. Volcanoes were used to heat. There were hot springs there. People came to. This was kind of a resort town. They certainly had earthquakes, but nobody expected this kind of level of destruction. So this is the city that you see today, and you can actually see that the earth is higher around it, that all of this had to be excavated out. Here are some views of some of these poor people that were buried alive. You can see them. Some of them were still struggling. Some of them were caught in an embrace. Herculaneum is even more kind of distressing. I remember when I first came to Herculaneum and I was walking up on the site, I couldn't see the city because it was like, where's the city? And then I finally got there, and this is where you enter the archaeological site here. And the entire city is 40 feet down. You can actually see that here. This is how much ash and mud poured down on the city in that time period. The rest of the city and the plain is at this level. So the whole city was just absolutely buried. This is the docks. This used to be the coast right here. Now, if you go back to this, you can tell the coast isn't there today. The coast is several miles that way. So really just absolutely remarkable destruction. The people, when they fled the city, they got to the coast and they had nowhere else to go. So they ran into these Aurea. Aurea are like warehouses on the coast. When they excavated this, they found bodies just piled up there that had been kind of boiled alive by and then buried alive by hot mud. Some of them still wearing their jewelry. But what was a tragedy for them is great for us because it preserves all of this wonderful archaeology and history. That's why archaeologists are such heartless monsters. Everybody else sees this and says, oh, what a horrible tragedy. And the archaeologists are like, woohoo! So don't let your babies grow up to be archaeologists. Let's take a look at Pompeii. So Pompeii was actually a large kind of working city. Both of these towns were resort towns back in the 1st century. Herculaneum was a little bit more upscale. So Herculaneum is kind of like the North Shore of Long Island. Pompeii was more like the Jersey Shore. So a little bit more working class. But it gives us a snapshot of what everyday urban life was like. The thing about Rome is that Rome continued to be an inhabited city, and inhabited cities get rebuilt. And as they get rebuilt, they tend to get destroyed. But this city, because it was preserved, it gives us a very nice look into it. We're going to look at a number of features. One, we're going to look at the Forum, which is right there. We're also going to look at the amphitheater, which is over here, and a number of smaller houses and other features as well. Let's start with the Forum right here. Almost every Roman city was built around a forum, and they're all more or less patterned after the Forum Romanum. They tend to be long, rectangular, and this is a place where you're going to have temples. So you have the temple, usually you have what's known as a Capitolium, or a temple to Jupiter, that's very prominent. That you would have large open courtyards for markets, other sections that would be sanctuaries or open springs. You can see that this is it today. You can see that it has the locations for various temples, but mostly it has a large open meeting place. This is what it would have looked like at the time, and like most every other Roman city, it has a basilica. So you kind of have a courthouse, you have the major temples, but then you have places for dedication, for music, for gatherings. Here's a reconstruction of what it would look like. This is the Temple of Jupiter Day. It's amazing how many of these columns were discovered and could be re-erected or intact. The Forum is the heart of the city, but I think what's more interesting to people is the city itself. That much of the city streets have been preserved, and were preserved even up to the 2nd story. A lot of this is reconstruction, but it shows you a city that had water fountains, and had sewers and running water. I love the stepping stones. The streets would get rather muddy, and so the stones are spaced so that carts could go over the top of them, but people could neatly hop from one stone to the other. It had raised sidewalks. It had storefronts. In many ways, it's very similar to a modern city. It would have had stores on the lower levels, shops, and porticos, and people could walk. And on the upper levels, there would have been apartments and other things where the store shop owners would live. So if you've ever been to any big cities, you probably would have recognized this. Everything that a city needs is there, including a bakery. The bakery has these grinding wheels that are used to grind wheat. They would have been turned either by men or by donkeys. So they're hourglass shaped. You put the wheat in the top, and the flour comes out and gathers on the shelves below. I love this oven. This oven looks exactly like pizza ovens today. And in some cases, because this was buried in hot ash, it carbonized the bread. So this is carbonized bread. We even have some of the bread that they made. Here it is with a bread stamp. So it can be broken into pieces. You even have fast food places. Thermopolium was a place where people would gather to dish out and ladle out hot food. People liked hot, cheap food, so here's a counter. And these jars would have stored a variety of things: soups, stews, condiments, hot garum. Garum was fermented fish guts, which was a very, very popular condiment in the Roman world. Romans ate lots of strange things, including badger noses and parrot tongues and flamingo livers. They had really kind of exotic and bizarre tastes. They used to eat whole dormice stuffed, just crazy stuff. So, but you could get a lot of hot food there. It was also a place where you could enjoy a bath. Romans loved bathing. Bathing was a very important part of Roman life, and anyone for a small fee could go and participate in the baths, and you could get clean. Baths had exercise yards, so they functioned in the same way as gymnasiums did in ancient Greece. They had hot caldariums, which were places where you could sweat out, like a sauna. And then they had frigidariums, where you could splash out cold water on yourself So this is the, I'm sorry, I got this wrong. This is the caldarium here, and this is the frigidarium. So here's the caldarium, so you could sweat out your pores here. They had changing rooms, of course, and some of these were very elaborate. This is a podetria, and a podetria is a place where you could, store your stuff. This is the locker room. Except, I go to the local gym. I don't have lockers that look like this. So each one of these niches was a place that you could put your stuff, and you'd give a small fee to a local an attendant who would watch your stuff, make sure it didn't get stolen. But look at the beautiful stucco reliefs. Look at the beautiful stucco figures. Somebody ought to rebuild one of these. And of course, it was a place where you could get entertainment. On the outskirts of the city is the amphitheater. An amphitheater is called an amphitheater because it's basically two theaters that have been joined together. You split this in half. Each side looks kind of like a theater. And this was a way of bringing two theaters together. And unlike the Greeks who built these things into the bowl of a hill, Romans like to build these as freestanding structures. So you have a staircase that gets you up to the top, and then you can walk around the exterior or walk down. This is one of the earliest amphitheaters we know of. And it has an oval arena in the center. People could sit on chairs on the wider benches down here, or you could just sit up in the bleacher seats if you weren't that high status. And of course, there was a whole variety of entertainments that would happen in the amphitheater. The biggest being, of course, the gladiatorial contests. Here's an actual fresco. What's interesting is you could actually do this in the shade. We know that they had a system of spars and masts that would hold up cloth so that you could watch your blood sport in shade. And the reason we know that is we actually have frescoes of a riot that broke out at this amphitheater, and there you can see the awning. So, hey, nice to be dine in comfort. But one of the more interesting things I think about Pompeii itself is that it gives you a sense of everyday Roman life. And it's the kind of urban matrix of the city. So you get outside of the Forum here, and the city is just a series of, what we would call row homes. Row homes aren't very common in Utah, but if you go back east to any of the big cities, there's row homes everywhere. And row homes are a very efficient way to, build a city because it saves on construction. So you have a street that goes through, and each one of these would be a separate unit. You can actually see that here. You can see how this is a separate home here that is distinct from this house here, and this is a kind of separate, section here. So this gives you a lot of privacy. A Roman house is actually built inside out compared to, modern houses. Modern houses they're very much, they're surrounded by lawns on all four sides, your modern American suburban home. So your grass and your open space is all on the outside, and your house and your living space is on the interior of the property. But Roman houses are exactly the opposite. They're built kind of inside out. That is, the rooms are on the outside, and the open spaces are on the interior. That way you can save on wall space, and you're built right up against your neighbor. Now that means that you can't build a window to the outside because that window would be built into your neighbor's house. So they tend to be very inward focused, and so they have these open spaces and atriums that exist. So you would come in the entrance. Often the front would be shops, and so these would be shops that you would either rent out or use for your own business. And you would come into the interior, and in the interior is the atrium. And the atrium is a place that has a thing called an impluvium, and an impluvium catches rainwater. So the atrium roof would catch the rainwater and funnel it into the impluvium. So this is a place where you could get fresh water. They had fresh water elsewhere that you could get throughout the city, but this was a way you could not have to go down to the street to the fountain or the well. You would have fresh water, but also it's a form of evaporative cooling, because the air would be pulled in over the water and the hot air would go out the atrium, and so it would keep this very cool. Pompeii and southern Italy are pretty warm countries, Mediterranean climate, so you need that. And all of the rooms, the bedrooms, which we call cubiculum, would look in on the atrium. Beyond the atrium, you would find the peristyle, and this is kind of like a garden. And so this is your lawn. This is where you could go outside. You would raise herbs or fruit trees or other things that you would need for the garden. Usually in the back of the peristyle would be the kitchen. And so they're actually very efficient homes, especially if you consider you don't need modern air conditioning to keep these nice. There's a lot of covered areas. You can see this one has the kitchen in the back, in the peristyle. The bedrooms are around the atrium. You could do business in the front, and you could have, all the other actions could take place. This is the house of Menander, and you can see again you have an atrium up top, and you have an impluvium to catch rainwater, to cool. There is a lararium, so it's an ancestral shrine in the corner, and then off to the side you would have the bedrooms. Now, the only source of light for the bedrooms would be the atrium, or maybe oil lamps, and so that tends to make these bedrooms kind of dark. And one of the things that is rather surprising about all these homes is every single home was just covered in lavish frescoes. Fresco is painting on wet plaster, and you see these beautiful frescoes, and it makes sense. So if you have a room that doesn't have any exterior windows, and they're relatively small, they would feel cramped, or kind of claustrophobic if you didn't open up the wall space. So all of the rooms would have been painted, and even the humblest homes have extensive wall paintings. It's really remarkable. So when this was first discovered, it was kind of a marvel. It's the largest corpus of classical painting that we had ever found up until that time. Remember, we don't have a lot of painting from the Greek period. Very little of it survives, if any. So when we look at this Pompeii stuff, it really was a revelation. It was really a way to look into not just painting, but to the daily life of everyday Romans. A scholar by the name of August Mau came along, and he divided up these paintings by styles that he thought were in a more or less chronological order. And he did it pretty much by intuition and guesswork, but he must have been pretty smart, because all of the evidence since then has pretty much backed up everything that he's suggested. So the first style was very simple. You just wanted a wall that wasn't a plain wall, so you would decorate it with faux masonry. So here you see a wall that has been drafted in plaster, and then the plaster blocks have been painted to resemble marble or colored stone. So this was the first style, and it's just a very simple, very easily recognizable style called faux masonry. The second style is a little bit more elaborate. The second style treats the room as if the walls are being opened up. So usually there is a lower kind of register that we call a dado that establishes a kind of, base. And then beyond that, it opens up into scenes, sometimes into gardens, sometimes into architectural vistas. And these are painted as if they're real life. These are meant to be illusionistic forms of painting designed to open up the wall space. So here in this villa of Penates Sinister, which seriously sounds like he's a character out of Harry Potter, but he's not. He's an actual person. So here in the villa of Penates Sinister, you can see how the walls are opened up, and it creates a kind of architectural motif back there with gardens. It really denies the wall space and opens up the space, which makes sense. When I was a kid in a magical time I like to call the 70s, it was very popular to have one wall in the house covered with mirrors. And we had some poor canary that would get out of the cage from time to time, and the first thing it would do is fly right into the mirror. Poor thing. But we did that because the idea was that it would open up the room and make the room feel bigger. And so this is the same thing. This is, opening up the room to make the room feel bigger. But there's also some wonderful panel paintings. We have really beautiful representations of classical figures sitting around, and they are painted on a human scale on what appears to be an actual three-dimensional space. Wonderful stuff. The most famous of these is going to be the Villa of the Mysteries. So the Villa of the Mysteries is a big, rich villa that's just outside Pompeii. The difference between a villa and a house is a villa is a kind of sprawling freestanding house, whereas a house or an insula is built into the urban fabric of the city. But this is not far outside the city. And in this room right here, there was a whole series of paintings that were just remarkable. You can see they're painted on a life size. So the lower walls have that dado zone, and we have a frieze of what is simulated colored marble up top. But then on the walls we have an arrangement of figures, and the figures are very lovely. They're painted with a high degree of modeling and dimension with classical drapery. Now the reason we call this the Villa of the Mysteries is we believe that this room is one of the rare surviving examples of the Dionysiac mysteries. There were many religions in ancient Rome. Rome was a very pluralistic society with many different religious traditions. And one of the more popular religious traditions at this time were the mystery religions. Mystery comes from the Greek mysterion, which literally means to keep your mouth shut. And that's why they were called mystery religions, because there were secret rites or initiations that were performed, and if you were a member of the society, you were not supposed to tell other people what went on in these religious societies. They were for you, they were for the initiated, and so you were to keep your mouth shut. You were to keep it a secret. And so to everyone else, this was a mystery. We didn't know what was going on. These mystery religions often focused on personal salvation. Roman religion was very much about the function of the house, maintenance of your family and of public order, but they didn't give anything in the way of like kind of private salvation. So people need a kind of sense of private salvation. So there were lots of these mystery religions. There was a mystery religion to Isis. The Eleusinian mysteries to Demeter and Persephone were very popular. And another one was the mystery religions of Dionysus. So the thing seems to figure on the person of Dionysus. Dionysus is the god of wine and of nature, but also of visions. But he's also a kind of salvational figure. So here is Dionysus right here, and he is reclining in the lap of who we assume to be Ariadne. So Ariadne was the daughter of King Minos in Knossos. She's the one that gave Theseus the secret to how to slay the Minotaur, and she did it only if he promised to take her off the island, but then Theseus later abandoned her on an island in the middle of the Aegean and left her alone. So don't rat out your families, girls. Anyhow, but Ariadne actually has a happy ending because the god Dionysus sees her and he comes down and he elevates her and makes her a goddess. So she becomes this happy ending. So in the Dionysiac mysteries, you are supposed to analogize yourself to Ariadne, that you are the lost soul who is looking for an afterlife and a salvation, and you will be plucked from your misery by the god Dionysus, who will elevate you to a divine state. So whether you are male or female, you're supposed to identify with her. So this is supposedly a scene of that kind of moment of salvation. Everything else is kind of mysterious. To one side, we have a scene of a figure holding a mask, and they are holding a mask over a character that has been identified as Silenus. Silenus is the god. This is Silenus right here. Silenus is usually seen as a kind of fat, comical character. He is a god of drunkenness and revelry. And notice that there is a scene, there's a mask of theater. So Dionysus was also a god of the theater. To the other side, we see a very strange scene with a woman who seems to be in distress. And next to her is a Fury. A Fury is a winged figure. And the Fury has a whip. And the Fury seems to be whipping a character around the corner. And this seems to be some kind of initiation rite. And so the figure is being flogged or purified by being flogged. And then we have Maenades, which are attendants. These wild women are their attendants to Dionysus. And one of them is playing a cymbal. And then on the opposite wall, we have a scene, a series of scenes that we can't really understand. We have a boy raiding a scroll, someone preparing dishes, other people preparing cloth. We have this scene here, where it has a woman in a state of shock, and she appears to be looking at the flogging that is happening on the opposite wall. So all of this is part of some initiation rite. some of this imagery gets really strange. We have a young woman here who's nursing a deer. And Dionysus is a god of nature, so that kind of makes sense, but it's a little bit bizarre. And we can't make heads or tails of it. We know that some kind of complicated initiation rite is happening, but much more beyond that, we can't really say. The one thing we can say about it is how incredibly beautiful it is. We have these deep, rich, varied colors. It's just forever destroy the idea that Romans ran around in white togas and clothing all the time. They didn't. They loved color just like we do. But we also have wonderful foreshortening, rendering of the human figure, a sense of these people being in the room, wonderful classical details, and on a full scale that again opens up and treats the wall spaces as a stage, as if it's a stage, and opens it up. Well, that style lasts until about the year 50 CE, and then we enter the third style. And the third style is minimalistic in the extreme compared to the second style. Instead of big scenes that deny the wall space and open up the wall space and give you illusionistic vistas, we have flat color and flat walls. We still have a kind of sense of a dado, but instead we have these flat walls and very dynamic colors, bold yellows, reds, and then we have either thin pinstriping or tiny little vignettes. If you look in the center, this is a vignette, and it shows a little idyllic kind of pastoral scene of pavilions out in nature. If you look at some of these other details, you'll notice that we have little Egyptian scenes. So here is a long candelabra. And notice that you can still see the shadow of the candelabra there. So this is still imagined as if it's a three-dimensional space. It's just very shallow. And this candelabra comes up not to a lamp, but to a little scene, almost like a postcard from Egypt. It's very strange. So the third style is very, very decorative, very, very flat. And it focuses instead on tiny little delicate figures, tiny little narratives, tiny little vignettes. And some of these vignettes are just very quickly and very lightly painted in. It's really quite delicate, monochromatic scenes, garlands hanging, stuff like that. And then shortly before Vesuvius erupts, we see the fourth style. And the fourth style is probably the most eclectic and varied of the group. It has attributes of all the other styles combined. It's like all the styles. I must have all the styles. So it has the faux masonry and the dado, but it also has big open spaces of flat color. But then it also has things that look like windows that look onto architectural vistas like the second style. But I think the most dramatic thing about the fourth style is it has panel paintings. And in these panel paintings, we have just really beautiful rendering. This is a rendering of Hercules discovering his son being nursed by a hind in this sanctuary of the goddess Demeter. Notice you have a high degree of modeling. You really get a sense of the highlights on Herc's glutes there. Beautiful drapery. But I think one of the things that's most fascinating is that if you look very closely, you can actually see that they painted a little cord as if this were hanging on the wall. Now, this isn't hanging on the wall. This is just painted on the wall. But it shows us that they did have paintings that they hung on the wall, just like we have paintings hung on the wall. But unfortunately, none of those have survived. So the fourth style ends up being, kind of very eclectic. And the last thing we want to talk about at this time period is funerary monuments and demonstrations of genre. It's again one of the best things about Roman art is that we have a much greater sense of the everyday life of people than we do in Greece. In Greece, it's art by elites for elites, but we have a much broader middle class and lower class, and even they have access to art. This is a knife merchant. This is a funerary relief of a knife merchant. And in this case, the knife merchant wanted you to know he was a knife merchant. So he is there at his stall showing off his wares that he's obviously very proud of, all the various different kinds of knives that you can have. And this was a very private devotional art where people were very took great pride in their professions and their identities. One of my favorite examples is this. This is the term of Urices the baker. And he was a freedman and obviously very successful as a baker, had a number of bake shops. And so he had his tomb built just outside of the city gates. This is the gate of the city. This is the Porta Maggiore. And so here is his tomb. And you wouldn't know this looking at this, but his tomb is actually in the shape of an oven. It's very appropriate. So if you're a baker, you're going to have a tomb in the shape of an oven. And at the top, there's a series of reliefs. And when we look at these reliefs, they're not going to be reliefs of gods or heroes. They're going to be reliefs that are very appropriate to a baker. And it shows bakers baking bread. So here is a donkey turning one of those grindstones. Here are people mixing bread. Here is another scene, and you can see all of his workers are mixing bread in a kneading trough. Didn't have KitchenAids or Bosches back in the Roman period, so you just got a lot of people to work their hands over it in a big kneading trough. And what I love is here is a baker loading bread into an oven, and they still have ovens that look like this in Italy. And he's using a peel to slide the ovens in. Looks just like a modern pizza oven. So again, these wonderful seemingly pedestrian quotidian details that are very, very charming and make Roman art very unique and very beautiful, but in a completely different way than Greek art. Okay, so that ends lecture number 10. High Empire lecture number 11 is coming soon. Look for it, and then we'll get into early medieval. Thanks so much. Catch you next time.